In the fall of 1813, William Atherton would be marched from Michigan to a military prison in Quebec. But there were other Americans marching north as well. With Lake Erie secure, the United States was free to try again to conquer the eastern heart of the Canadian colonies, Montreal and even Quebec.
In the fall of 1813, Canada faced the most serious threat to its continued existence as a British colony. The Americans sent one large army of 7,000 men down the St. Lawrence towards Montreal, and another army of 5,000 men marching up the Champlain Valley to then rendezvous with them at Montreal.
With a total of 12,000 soldiers, this was the largest American operation of the war. But once again, the Americans put an invasion into the hands of incompetent officers.
The larger army was commanded by James Wilkinson, a somewhat strange, corrupt Revolutionary War veteran. Commanding the other army coming up the Champlain Valley was a Carolina planter named Wade Hampton, of whom it could be said his most salient feature was that he loathed Wilkinson. Neither men could stand each other.
The two forks of America's 1813 invasion would never be in tune. Wilkinson and Hampton each carried out his own private war. On October 25th, Hampton led his army to the Chateauguay River, just inside the Canadian border. There, he engaged the enemy, but not the British.
There were no British troops there. There was a Canadian force that was at Chateauguay, and mostly French-Canadian. The French-Canadian population basically sided with the British because, as one British officer put it, they trusted the Americans even less than the British.
The French-Canadian regiment at Chateauguay, the Voltigeurs, was commanded by Lieutenant Charles Michel de Salaberry. The Americans hoped that he and his volunteers wouldn't have their heart in the battle.
Hampton sent an officer forward on horseback who could speak French and asked him to harangue the Canadians, tell them to surrender. So this officer dutifully rode forward and said, "Brave Canadians, give yourselves up. We have no argument with you. We come to bring you liberty and freedom." De Salaberry took a musket from one of his men and he fired a long-range shot which dropped the American officer in mid-speech.
They formed, they attacked. The Americans were repelled on the west side of the river. And on the east side of the river, they tried to surround the Canadian force. They were beaten there too by an ambush in the woods.
The Canadians were outnumbered 5-1. Still, Hampton had the American forces retreat across the border. Half the invasion of 1813 was finished.
The Battle of Chateauguay loomed very large in Canadian mythology. The battle was fought primarily by Canadians and their Aboriginal allies. And so that one is rightfully claimed as a great Canadian victory.
There were principally French Canadians there, but there were also Scottish, Irish, even German Canadians who took part, all of whom used French as kind of a common language at the time, and who fought well together in defense of their farms. It was perhaps one of the first times in Canadian history that the disparate populations of Canada had ever fought together in a common cause.
Hampton's wing of the invasion had been beaten back, but General James Wilkinson was still sailing his 7,000-man American army toward Montreal.
Wilkinson is heading east along the St. Lawrence River.
It's estimated that a log would float down the St. Lawrence River faster than Wilkinson's fleet went.
Almost from the day they set out, General Wilkinson began dosing himself with laudanum to fight off dysentery. Wilkinson appears, from witnesses, to have miscalculated his dosage. And from time to time, he was wont to break into song and tell funny stories about previous experience when he should maybe have kept his nose to the grindstone.
Wilkinson had never commanded even a regiment in battle and expected the worst. In case of misfortune, he decided, the army must surrender. When his forces met up with the British at Chrysler's Farm, Wilkinson stayed behind.
His army outnumbers the British 3-1. The vast numerical superiority he enjoys is completely negated by the fact that he doesn't even show up to conduct the battle himself.
The Americans attacked through the mud of the fields at Chrysler's Farm and were driven back by volley after volley of accurate gunfire. The Americans were forced to retreat.
Wilkinson simply withdraws and abandons the entire attempt. His army hasn't been destroyed, he just doesn't have the stomach to continue.
Wade Hampton resigned his commission and returned to South Carolina. James Wilkinson faced a court-martial but was acquitted. In the United States, the invasion of 1813 was forgotten as quickly as possible. In Canada, the militia's role in the battles of Chateauguay and Chrysler's Farm would be remembered forever.
Canadians weren't quite sure who they were before the War of 1812. But after the War of 1812, the key populations knew who they weren't, and they weren't American.
In Canada, we have the emergence following the war of something known as the militia myth, which would plague the Canadian military right up until the First World War. And this was the idea that the farmer, the clerk, the ordinary individual could be called up, given a weapon, sent to the field, and defeat whomever opposed. Because after all, in the Canadian mind, it was these people who had won the War of 1812.
Laura Secord was another ordinary Canadian who came to Britain's aid in the War of 1812. A 37-year-old housewife from Queenston, she became famous for struggling through 20 miles of wilderness alone to warn the British about an impending attack. There's been debate about the usefulness of her trek, but over time she became a legend. On the 100th anniversary of her journey, a Canadian chocolate company adopted her name and image as its logo. By 1992, she was put on a postage stamp as a true national hero.
Modern historians look at her representing the pioneer woman's experience. A lot of courage, a lot of fortitude was necessary for many pioneer women to survive in the Canadas in those days. And I think, in a sense, she has become representative of that collective experience.
It's indicative also of the post-war thinking process that both nations have coming out of the war. Both Canada and the United States have this grasping for national heroes.
By late 1813, it was the American side that was running short of heroes. They'd secured the Great Lakes only to launch another invasion that crumbled in the face of smaller British forces. Morale for the American army was at rock bottom, just as it was for young William Atherton, freezing in Quebec.
It was an uninterrupted scene of suffering from beginning to end for a company of cold, ragged, and starved Kentucky boys. Often people came to see us in the prison. An idea prevailed that we were wild men or an order of beings that scarcely belonged to this earth.
Atherton would spend another year trying to survive the horror of military prison. And on the Niagara border, it would be a winter of horror on all sides.
Warfare at the time between Christian nations, there were certain conventions that one followed at the time. And one of those conventions is that you did not disturb the civilian populace, if possible. So that you could capture an enemy village, but you would not plunder the houses in that village. You would not burn civilian property.
But earlier in the year, poorly disciplined American troops had burned the public buildings in the capital of Upper Canada, York, the tiny town that eventually would become Toronto. The burning of York was just the prologue, the first in a string of actions that would make this war a milestone in the growing history of brutality.
On the 10th of December, 1813, the Americans set fire to the town of Newark, which is now Niagara-on-the-Lake. It was a very cold, snowy day, and by, the middle of the afternoon, the town was virtually a smoking ruin, and people were homeless and left to try and fend for themselves in the bitter winter conditions. There was one woman who was ill in bed. They moved her bed outside the house and just left her in the snow while they set fire to her house.
The British called for an immediate retaliatory strike. This kicks off a rash of burning that really lay waste to the entire Niagara frontier by the end of the year.
In one day, the British burned 3 towns to the ground. In Lewiston, one American said, "Our neighbors were seen lying dead in the fields and roads, some horribly cut and mangled, others eaten by the hogs." Then it was Buffalo's turn. Shadrach Byfield was there.
We took possession of the place. Orders were given so that no dwelling was to be spared except one, where the dead body of a child lay who had been shot in the street. This was in compassion towards the sorrowful mother.
The people of Buffalo gathered at the river and watched the smoke rise. Burning cinders from their homes sailed toward them, borne on the wind, and the sound of wailing and sobbing too rose on the wind. Fire had bred fire.
People are being not only put out of their houses by the burnings, but they're being killed and maimed in some very atrocious ways. People are being scalped, people are being tortured, carried off, separated from the rest of their families. It's really a tragic scene of affairs on both sides.
When the war broke out, the officers from the American garrison at Fort Niagara were at church across the river with British officers in St. Mark's Church in Newark. They were friends and neighbors. They traded across the border. They married across the border. By the end of 1813, it was a scene of desolation. The Canadian and American side of that river were just desolation.
By the end of 1813, President James Madison was hoping hard for peace. On December 30th, word arrived that Britain would negotiate, and Madison sent representatives off to Europe. But negotiations would not begin for over 7 months. As the United States hoped for peace, the country finally began to become proficient at war.
This is not the American army that went to war in the fall of 1812. What you have is a new, younger, aggressive breed of American officer. Men like Jacob Brown and Winfield Scott have done a tremendous amount of drilling and training of the troops under their command. This really represents the coming of age of the American Army.
The improved American Army would show its mettle in the summer of 1814. In July, Jacob Brown's troops battled British regulars twice on the Niagara Peninsula. On July 5th, in a field near the Chippewa River, Winfield Scott led his brigade right through a hail of artillery fire, causing the British to retreat. 3 weeks later, by a Canadian cemetery within earshot of Niagara Falls, the two armies met again, this time in one of the bloodiest battles of the war, a desperate encounter at Lundy's Lane.
It's the worst kind of battle you could want to fight. It's an unplanned meeting engagement with continuous reinforcement on both sides. And highly unusual for the time, it goes on into the night. One American participant called it a conflict obstinate beyond description. They got stuck into each other, and they weren't going to let go.
The soldiers were firing their muskets at each other at only a few feet away. The flash from the musket fire might scorch their clothes as the musket ball went flying by.
Shadrach Byfield. Our bugle sounded for the company to drop. A volley was then fired upon us, which killed 2 corporals and wounded a sergeant and several of the men. The company then arose, fired, and charged.
Units of the American Army performed very well, and at battles like Chippewa and Lundy's Lane, the British are, grudgingly respecting of the American performance. They stand on the field of battle under gunfire, and they don't flinch. And at this point, the British say, well, these guys have actually learned how to do this.
By the end of 5.5 hours of fighting, close to a third of both armies are dead or wounded, or run off in the night. Brown was badly wounded during the battle. Scott was seriously wounded. On the British side, General Drummond was wounded. Major General Ryle was not only badly wounded, he was also captured. It was a bad night for generals, Lundy is saying, and that's a fact. It was a bad night for everybody.
Shadrach Byfield. The 49th suffered severely in this engagement. In the morning, we collected the wounded and received orders to burn the dead.
Shadrach Byfield had escaped unscathed from what had been one of the bloodiest battles in the war. 2 weeks later, in a much smaller fight, Byfield was hit by a musket ball below the elbow.
There was no ability to repair that kind of damage, so on any limb that was hit, the typical treatment would be to amputate.
This is done without anesthetic. The surgeons were quite good at what they were doing, and they were quick. You've got the so-called loblollies that are standing by with the surgeons who are ready to hold you down as he takes off a limb with things that we would normally find at a hardware store.
Our doctor informed me that my arm must be taken off. They had meant to hold me, but I told them there was no need of that. The operation was painful and tedious.
Byfield had his forearm amputated and still had enough presence of mind after the operation was over. The attendant was going to take it out and throw it in a pile of limbs. He said, no, bring that back. I want to give that arm a decent burial, and he did.
A few boards were nailed together for a coffin. My hand was put into it and buried on the ramparts. The stump of my arm soon healed, and 3 days after, I was able to play a game of cards for a quart of rum.
The Niagara